The movie opens on July 4th, 1969, in Vallejo, California. Darlene and her lover, Mike, sit talking inside their parked car when a mysterious man approaches out of the darkness and opens fire. Moments later, the killer himself calls the police to report the crime. When officers arrive, they find only Mike alive, barely holding on. Soon after, at the San Francisco Chronicle, cartoonist Robert Graysmith arrives for work just in time to hand in his sketches during a staff meeting. In the middle of it, Templeton's secretary delivers a strange letter from an anonymous sender claiming responsibility for Darlene's murder and another couple's shooting. Inside the envelope is a cryptic cipher along with a demand: print this on the front page or more people will die. The newsroom freezes. Nobody knows if it's a hoax until senior writer Paul Avery calls the police and confirms every detail is real. The editors choose to run the story on page 4. Paul jokes that the killer probably hid his name inside the cipher, but Robert quietly disagrees, claiming the killer will never reveal who he is. Within hours of publication, a schoolteacher solves the cipher. Paul rushes to Robert with the decoded text, asking how he knew the killer wouldn't sign his name. Robert ignores the question and starts reading the confession, where the killer describes murder as a sport and declares humans to be the most dangerous animal of all. Robert recognizes that line, though he can't place it yet. Another letter arrives soon after, in which the killer refers to himself as the Zodiac and uses a symbol as his signature. Months later, a couple relaxing near a lake is brutally stabbed by a masked man. As before, the killer calls the police to report his own crime. Back at the Chronicle, Robert finally remembers where he heard the Zodiac's dangerous animal quote. It's from The Most Dangerous Game, a movie about a man who hunts humans for fun. The Zodiac seems to be imitating it. Days later, a cab driver named Stein is shot dead in San Francisco. From a nearby house, a group of kids witness the killer wipe down the cab before walking away. Detective Dave Toschi and his partner William Armstrong arrive and discover the killer left a pair of gloves inside the vehicle. The following morning, the Chronicle receives another letter, this one containing a blood-stained piece of the cab driver's shirt. Zodiac claims responsibility again and threatens to shoot out a school bus next. Toschi and Armstrong head to the Chronicle to read the letter themselves, warning Paul not to print anything about the school children. A handwriting expert later confirms the letter as authentic, and the police release the information to the media. Back at the Chronicle, Robert's fascination with the case grows. He tells Paul that he believes Zodiac deliberately killed Stein to break his earlier pattern of targeting couples and to confuse the investigation. Meanwhile, Inspector William begins contacting police departments from the other Zodiac attack locations. From one of the reports, he learns that the footprints found at Darlene's murder scene match military-issue shoes, suggesting the killer has a military background. He also asks about the surviving victim, Mike, only to discover that he has quietly left town. Late that night, Dave Toschi receives a call. The Zodiac has phoned again. This time, he demands to speak with TV host Melvin Belli. Dave and William pick Melvin up and prepare him for the call, telling him he has to convince the killer to meet in person. During the broadcast, the Zodiac calls in and gives the name Sam. Melvin calmly asks what he wants, and Zodiac says he suffers from constant headaches. When Melvin suggests meeting his chiropractor, the killer abruptly hangs up. Dave suspects he realized the call was being traced. Melvin then announces live on air that the call isn't being traced, prompting Zodiac to call again. This time, he says killing people stops the headaches. Melvin asks to meet, and Zodiac agrees, choosing the location himself. But the next day, he never shows up. Voice analysis later reveals that only the first call was genuine. The second was from a mental hospital patient pretending to be Zodiac. A week passes before another letter arrives. Zodiac warns that he won't announce his murders anymore and reveals he is building a bomb to store in his basement for future use. Dave and William are stuck. Almost nobody in that area even has basements. Later that night, Paul Avery and Robert discuss the new letter at a bar. When Paul asks why Robert is so fixated on the case, Robert simply says he loves puzzles. A week later, Melvin receives another letter, this time claiming Zodiac needs help because he's thinking of going on a killing spree. Melvin tells Dave and William that Zodiac has tried calling his house multiple times, but his maid always tells him her boss is out. Soon after, Zodiac resurfaces. He offers a stranded woman and her baby a ride after her car breaks down. Once inside the car, he threatens to kill her and throw the baby out the window. Fortunately, she jumps out before he can act. In the following weeks, Zodiac sends multiple letters confirming the attempt and also claims responsibility for several recent murders. But the Chronicle stops covering his letters. Paul explains to Robert that it's a smart tactic. Zodiac probably hasn't killed anyone since Paul Stein. He also shows Robert that Zodiac now sends his letters after the crimes hit the news, not before. suggesting he might be taking credit for crimes he didn't commit. Paul even points out that the killer may have taken his name and symbol from a watch brand called Zodiac. Months later, after a long silence, Paul receives a new letter, this one again containing a piece of Stein's blood-soaked shirt. Furious, he realizes Zodiac is now targeting him personally. Dave tells him it's probably because Paul publicly insulted Zodiac in one of his articles. Terrified, Paul buys a gun. At the shooting range, he tells Robert he's meeting a mysterious informant in Riverside who might have evidence about Zodiac. He asks Robert to come, but Robert declines because he has a date with a woman named Melanie. Later that night, Robert arrives late to the date and apologizes. When Melanie asks where Paul is, Robert tells her, and she panics, fearing Paul may have walked straight into a trap, perhaps directly into the hands of the Zodiac. Robert immediately panics and calls Paul's wife to ask if he checked in. When she says he hasn't, Robert and Melanie rush home and wait anxiously. Hours later, Paul finally calls, breathless, and says he's uncovered something huge. Moments after, he appears on the evening news announcing that a murder in Riverside may actually be the Zodiac's first kill. Dave and William are stunned, furious that Paul went to the media before informing them. The next day, Dave and a team of detectives travel to Riverside and discover the killer also sent a confession letter, mirroring the Zodiac's style. Not long after, Dave and William receive a new lead from a man named Cheney. He claims his old friend Arthur Lee Allen once talked openly about wanting to kill people, send taunting letters to the police, and even call himself the Zodiac. Cheney says he reported this years ago, but police never believed him. With this new tip, the detectives finally meet Lee, accompanied by Sergeant Mullinax. Lee denies everything, though he admits police questioned him after the first Zodiac murder when a neighbor reported seeing him with bloody knives. Lee casually mentions the neighbor died of a heart attack a week later. As the interview goes on, the officers notice his military boots, identical to prints found at a Zodiac crime scene, and a Zodiac brand watch, complete with the killer's symbol. Lee says it was just a birthday gift. Growing irritated, he insists he's innocent, but adds, "Even if I were the Zodiac, I wouldn't tell you." He also admits he once told a man named Phil that his favorite book is The Most Dangerous Game. After he leaves, Dave is convinced Lee is their strongest suspect yet. They meet Lee's brother, who says Lee has always been mentally unstable. His sister-in-law also reveals Lee spelled Christmas the exact same odd way the Zodiac did in his letters. Despite this, the detectives can't obtain a warrant due to insufficient evidence. A year later, Dave finally secures a warrant for Lee's trailer. Inside, he and William find several guns, gloves, and shoes matching the Zodiac's size. Lee arrives mid-search, but says nothing. Days later, the captain crushes their hopes. None of the handwriting matches the Zodiac's. 4 years pass. While sifting through old documents, Robert believes someone has to write a full book on the Zodiac. He pitches the idea to Paul, who refuses, now unemployed after sending a letter demanding control of the investigation. Determined, Robert begins researching alone. He visits Dave for help, but the detective brushes him off, explaining the case has gone cold. No letters in 3 years. Eventually, Dave tells him to talk to a man named Ken. When Robert meets him, Ken directs him to Mullinax, who arranges access to the original files from Darlene's murder. After digging deeper into the case, Robert uncovers a new lead and meets with Dave again. He explains that according to the files, Darlene once had an admirer who showed up at a painting party in her house, someone who frightened her. Robert also reveals that before Darlene's family even learned about her death, 2 relatives received anonymous calls filled with nothing but heavy breathing. This convinces him that the Zodiac likely knew Darlene personally. Because Mike still can't be found, Robert insists he can track down Darlene's sister Linda and asks Dave for help. Dave then tells him about Melvin's maid, the woman who spoke to the Zodiac when he called Melvin's house. Robert rushes there, and while waiting for Melvin to arrive, the maid immediately realizes why he's come. She quietly admits she once talked to the Zodiac herself. When Robert asks what he said, she recalls only one chilling line. He needed to kill someone because it was his birthday. Using that clue, Robert deduces the Zodiac's birthday as December 18th. He runs to Dave with this new information, and Dave sends him to speak with someone named Mel. But Mel dismisses the birthday as meaningless and says no suspect was born on December 18th. He urges Robert to focus on hard evidence instead. Determined, Robert schedules a meeting with handwriting expert Sherwood. But when he gets home, Melanie confronts him, angry that Robert's Zodiac research has leaked into the newspaper. Robert tries to brush it off, but the tension spikes when the phone suddenly rings. Robert answers, only to hear an anonymous man whisper that he knows who the Zodiac is. The caller insists Robert must find someone named Bob, a friend of the Zodiac who has hidden film canisters as evidence. He also claims the Zodiac is a man named Rick. The next day, Sherwood tells Robert none of the handwriting samples match, but reveals that a woman named Penny visited him earlier and also claimed the Zodiac is Rick. Robert is stunned. It's the second time he's heard the same name. Sherwood adds that he's never officially cleared Rick as a suspect. Later, Robert receives another random call, only heavy breathing again. Shaken, he visits Ken to ask about Rick. Ken reveals Rick was always his favorite suspect because during an interview, Rick seemed more worried about wiping his fingerprints than answering questions. Ken suggests tracking down Rick's handwriting to compare. Robert contacts Penny again, and though she refuses at first, she eventually sends a theater poster written by Rick. Sherwood analyzes it and says it's the closest match he's ever seen. He just needs more samples. Meanwhile, Dave receives a new Zodiac letter with his name in it. But instead of being praised, he's dragged into questioning. The department believes he forged the letter for attention. The next day, when Robert meets Dave asking for help to find Linda, Dave snaps. He tells Robert that Sherwood has become a drunk who lost his job and orders him to stay away from the case for good, because Dave has sacrificed too much already, only to end up accused himself. The next day, Robert teams up with Ken to track down Linda. After some digging, he learns that she's actually in jail. When he gets home excited about the discovery, Melanie questions what he's trying to accomplish. Robert insists he only wants to find the killer, but Melanie is clearly shaken. Someone has been calling their house every night. Robert brushes it off and says he needs to meet Bob. Soon after, he meets Bob near a restaurant, and Bob suggests continuing the conversation at his home. Once there, Robert asks about Rick. Bob asks if it's about the film canisters, explaining that Rick eventually came to retrieve them. When Robert asks for posters Rick supposedly wrote, Bob reveals he was the one who wrote them all. The atmosphere turns unsettling as Bob invites Robert to follow him into the basement. Growing increasingly uneasy, Robert panics and leaves. When he returns home, he discovers that Melanie has taken the kids away. The next day, Robert visits Linda in prison. He asks her about the strange man who showed up at Darlene's painting party. Linda explains that Darlene was terrified of this person and constantly warned others to stay away from him. After thinking for a moment, she remembers his name, Lee. Robert immediately rushes to Mullinax to re-examine the old case files. He confirms that Linda had indeed mentioned Lee before, but Mullinax dismisses it. Lee was already cleared. Disappointed, Robert heads home, only to receive another silent call filled with heavy breathing. Moments later, Melanie arrives and confronts him about his obsession. She tells him she's leaving until he finishes his work and hands him an envelope before walking out. Inside, Robert finds a copy of Leahy's ID. Born on December 18th, the same birthday the maid mentioned. Shocked, he drives straight to Dave's house in the middle of the night. Though Dave threatens to call the police, he opens the door when Robert mentions Lee. Robert shows him the ID and lays out everything. Dave admits that Lee was the only suspect who ever contacted him, sending a typed letter offering help while he was supposedly in prison. Dave also points out that Lee was incarcerated during the years when Zodiac letters mysteriously stopped. At sunrise, they continue the conversation elsewhere. Robert explains that Lee once lived in his grandmother's basement, only a few miles from where Darlene worked. Dave suddenly realizes Lee knew Darlene. He thanks Robert for helping him finally settle the question and tells him to finish writing his book. Later, Robert visits the hardware store where Lee works. They lock eyes. Lee recognizes him and quietly tenses up. Robert says nothing and simply walks away. 7.5 years later, Mike finally comes out of hiding. Detective George arranges a meeting and presents him with photos of suspects. Without hesitation, Mike points to Lee as the man who shot him, rating his certainty an 8 out of 10. Although authorities prepare to charge Arthur Lee Allen, he dies of a heart attack before they can move forward. Years later, DNA testing from a Zodiac letter does not match him, but investigators still refuse to eliminate him as a suspect. The SFPD deactivates the case in 2004, though other counties keep it open. Dave retires and is officially cleared of forging Zodiac letters. Paul dies in 2000. Robert moves back to San Francisco, reconnects with his children, and says he hasn't received a single anonymous call since the day Arthur died. If you enjoyed this recap of the Zodiac, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell to catch all our upcoming movie summaries. See you soon.